So I will start with basic provisioning. So when we are thinking about provisioning, we usually have some resource like a database, LDAP server, something like that. And we want to create projection of user accounts there. So that's quite natural. But imagine you want to do this for each individual user, or configure for each individual user where they should have an account. Might be complicated and very, very hard to maintain. So this is solved quite naturally using roles and hierarchy of the roles. So I put just a simple example. We can have a user who has a role teacher, and the role teacher immediately give a user account or, for example, Canvas service. And then role teacher might be actually an extension of role employee, and role employee gives LDAP account and Zoom account, and another, again, as an example. I think this is quite straightforward how we work with roles, or instead of a role, you can even imagine a group, but MidPoint uses roles instead of group, but in principle, it's the same, really. I think this concept is really natural and there is no problem with that so far. But in MidPoint, we are considering all the objects we have there almost equal. So instead of using user and creating an account on some resources, we rather use terms focus and the projection. And I will explain why is that, because in our simple example, we have user and we are creating a projection on a resource LDAP account for that user. But thinking of it, just extending the concept, we can work in a similar way with roles. So instead of a user as the focus object that I want to project somewhere, I can use a role. And the projection, of course, won't be an account, but for example, it can be a mailing list or mail server. So I can create a mapping which will transform roles into mailing lists. In a similar way, how I can transform users into LDAP accounts. And again, because you don't want to configure for each user what accounts the user should have, we have some abstraction in form of roles. So I have users, and I'm putting the users into roles. For example, I have a role which tells me that all users who has this role should have an LDAP account. So I have user, role, and the role defining that all users should have an LDAP account. And I can do the similar thing for roles. It's the same thing, just instead of users, I'm using roles. So I have some roles, then I can define, and it's proper to not name it role again, so we are using Metarole for that. So it's a role for a role. So Metarole, which defines, okay, all this role who has this Metarole assigned should be projected as a mailing list. So again, the same concept with users, but with roles and the projection to mailing list. And I like to just visualize it like that, because with users, it's quite natural and everybody gets it immediately. With roles, it might be quite tricky. So that's why we are using the term Metarole. So what is Metarole? Metarole is very simple, a role for roles. And there are two main usages for it. First one is provisioning, as we just described, on a mailing list. So I define a meta role, which should just transform another roles into mailing lists. Or it can be used for policies. So the meta role can give the assigned roles some policy properties. For example, I can define a policy which will tell that all roles for which this policy is applied needs approval for any assignment of users to this role. And of course, I can define it in a role as some property, but I can have 100 of such roles for which I want to apply the policy. So it's way better to define it as a meta role and just assign this meta role to this 100 roles and have the same behavior for all these 100 roles defined in a single place. So then it's very easy to maintain, very easy to change the policy if I need to, and it works just like that. And these both usages can be even combined as I show on the picture. So I can have policy applied at the same as at the same time as another meta role, and it will work just as expected. So what are the advantages of using meta roles? And again, in principle, the advantages are exactly the same as the advantages and reasons why we are using roles for users instead of just manually configuring for each user what accounts should the user have. So the meta roles have the same advantages, but instead of users, we are working with roles. So to sum it up, the main advantage is to avoid duplicating of configuration. So if I have one policy, I don't want to define it for each role when I want to apply the policy to. I want to define the policy in a single place, which is the meta role, and then just assign this policy to all the roles that I want to apply it. Second thing is configuration clarity. If I'm using meta roles, I can easily check what the meta role has defined, what roles are members of the meta role. So everything is very clear, very easy to understand, very easy to check what the configuration is. And of course, it can be combined with other principles. So in the beginning, we were discussing some role hierarchy, where the role teacher was extending role employee. And we can do the same thing with roles. So I have two examples here. I have just one role, which should be critical business role as my meta role. And critical business role means there are two rules applied. First one is that any assignment to this role required approval. So that's the policy role. And second policy role that I want there, that all critical roles required to have an owner defined. So I have this critical business role, and I can create any number of roles which I can classify as critical business roles, and all the rules will be applied just like that. And if one day I decide that critical business roles should meet any other requirement or should be provisioned somewhere, for example, to some, I don't know, public list or list which are reported to managers, I can add it easily to the meta role definition, and it will be immediately applied to all the roles that are marked as a critical business role. And in the same way, I can define just a normal business role, which I have on the bottom. And for example, I will reuse the policy that require owner and use it there. So I'm combining the meta roles with roles extension. And you might notice I put the word inducement into the arrow, which is used as an extension of the role. So I want to cover that. What's the difference between assignments and inducements? Because there are two terms which are used very heavily when we are using roles and meta roles and other stuff. So assignment basically define a relation between two objects. So I can have user who's assigned to a role. And inducement, it's not a standalone relation, but it's rather extension of the previous relation. So this nicely illustrated on the example, so I can have a role who's assigned to a role, that's assignment, but the role has some inducement. And the inducement say there should be a projection as an LDAP account. So the inducement in this case is not applied to the role, but rather to the object assigned to the role, which means user. So in this configuration, there will be a LDAP account created for the user. And same thing you can see on the second picture below, where I have a role teacher, and again there is an inducement of role employee. That means that a role teacher is just extending the role employee, and the role employee again is extended with creating some projection, some accounts onto individual resources. So at the end, all this projection will be applied to the user because it's the first assignment, and the inducement betweens are just basically extension of that assignment relation. Okay, so that we covered roles, meta-roles, and assignments and inducements, and I want to go to another objects because it's just another piece of the puzzle. So if we consider orgs objects, they are basically identical to roles. The only difference is how they are displayed in the user interface, because roles are displayed as a flat structure, but orgs are displayed in a hierarchy. But in any other meaning, orgs and roles are practically the same thing. So I can define what I can define in a role, I can define in org. For example, some policies, some account constructions, additional mappings. It's the same. So if I had an example before when I was transforming roles to mailing list, I can use the same thing with orgs, and I can use Metarole to transform org in a mailing list. Theoretically, instead of Metarole, I can use another org to define the rule there, but that would be not that natural. So technically it's possible. Logically, I wouldn't recommend it because it's confusing. But on a technical level, nothing prevents it because role and org is practically the same thing. Also, what's different between role and orgs is for orgs, we have some built-in search function which are using the natural hierarchy of the roles. Natural hierarchy of orgs. So for example, I can easily search all members within the whole hierarchy of orgs, or I can easily say if a user is member of given org, even though it might be deeper in the hierarchy. So this is just a small extension, but otherwise roles and orgs are the same thing. But why are orgs there? This small differences are the one reason, and second reason is for you to be able to design your IdM system and have some clarity there, have the object separated in some way. So the recommended usage of orgs might be, for example, for your organization structure, really to have faculties, departments, some groups, and so on. Then some white label custom groups, which can be even created by the user themselves, again, depending what you need. But again, if we're talking about groups, we are expecting some hierarchy. So the orgs is probably a good way to model really any generic groups, maybe some project structure. And I'm quite sure you can figure out some other examples, maybe some classes, whatever is needed. And for you to be able to do that, the orgs is generally a tree, but this tree can have multiple nodes, so you can have parallel structure. So for example, you can have your organization structure, and next to it, completely independent, you can have your project structure, both modeled using orgs. Second tricky objects is service objects, and we talked about it the last time, but I would just try to summarize it somehow. So services are absolutely identical to roles. There is no difference at all. It's just a different name for the object, but on the technical level, they are completely the same. And the services, when we created them, was meant as a kind of hybrid between users and roles. because we have some type of usages where it's very hard to define if it's a user or role or how we should think about it. So I will just give you some examples which hopefully will bring some clarity into it. So for example, service account. You need to work with some account for machine-to-machine communication. You want to have it in your IdM system and provision it to really create an account. So this can be then used into machine-for-machine communication. And you can model it as a user, but it might be not it, because for user, you normally just imagine a living person. So have a service account there. It's possible, maybe have some flag or subtype to differentiate it. But for some people, it might be more natural to have it in some other category. And that's exactly why the service objects are there for. Second example might be representation of devices. For example, how to put a printer in your IdM or some Internet of Things devices. So again, service might be a good object, how to represent those. And also when you want to create account for your web page, for example, or for application that are just using MidPoint API to do something. Again, you can use user object, but you can use service object as well. And again, it's depending completely on you, how you have your object structured, so you maintain some clarity and it's understandable for you. And on top of this, you can define archetypes. And archetypes is just, I'm going to say, the principle for additional categorization of objects. So you have your users and you can define different archetypes, for example, to categorize them as internal users and external users. When you have roles, it can be, for example, business roles or API roles or just roles for creating accounts. And you can use archetypes to define these different categories. And again, put some additional way how to add some categories, how to bring more clarity into your configuration, how to make it easier for all the administrator to understand what's happening there. And the benefits are visual. You can define custom icons, custom colors, so you can immediately see that it's different type of objects. You can search based on archetypes, or even in the user interface, put some selective views in the menu, so you can easily on one click list, for example, only internal users and not the external, or vice versa. All of this is possible. And you can also limit some assignments. So for example, I can define a role which can be only used for internal users or only used for devices, and the device might be an archetype of service. So all these combinations are possible. And of course, it needs some time to think about it, how we want to structure it, which rules we want to apply. But at the end, it might simplify the whole IdM from just a set of objects and relations, actually defining some additional categories and which categories can be combined together and make it easier even for non-professionals to interact with this type of objects and use them. So if you move to a bit of technical level, archetypes on a technical level is just a meta role. So you can use all the benefits that Metaroles offer you. Instead of these visual types that we just discussed, you can put some additional rules, policies, for example, or provisioning. So just that you define an archetype for some user and say this user has this archetype might lead to provisioning, immediately creating some accounts or applying different policies. So it can be all tied into archetype. And again, this is just a way how you can make your configuration comprehensible. There's one current limitation with the archetype. For now, there's only one archetype allowed per object. So that might limit the archetype. For example, if you want archetype employee and the student, you might hit the limitation because it's quite normal that some students can be employees at the same time. So this is not possible at the moment. But for the future, we are thinking about how to discard this limitation. So using the archetypes, you can really nicely wrap this up and make some extra categorization and get to the full potential of all the objects. Because, for example, you can have the orgs and then use the different archetype to define what is really your organization structure, what is your project structure, what are just the custom groups. Or if you are integrated systems, you can, for example, use one archetype for all groups that are managed by grouper. And again, you can clearly see on the first look what is managed by grouper, what is managed inside MidPoint. So all of this is possible. And this is mostly what I have prepared for today, but we can even extend the concept. So I will just show you some preview. And the next step is to understand meta-roles, or in short, roles of higher order. That means it's not just role for role, but you have multiple roles assigned to each other, and each of them can have different meaning. So if we are thinking about roles of higher orders or meta roles, it's basically role for role for role. And only difficult part is to define what objects should be used in what way. And we have some order constraints you can define, or for example, this can be used only for users which they are on second level of the assignment chain, or for all users anywhere in the chain. And you can work with that. And we have something which is called assignment path, which is the path going from the first object, which is usually the user, to end objects, which might be org on a row or a role. For example, I have role in this example, and you can go through all the assignments, all the objects on the assignments, and define any arbitrary rules. So I just put an illustration picture here, which can be completely normal. You can have some org structure, you have users in the orgs, and then you have some roles assigned to the different piece of the org tree, and you want to define what should happen. And anything that you can imagine can be defined. So for example, the role can take all the orgs and transform them into LDAP groups, respecting the hierarchy which is between the org, and then put users inside. Or the role can be really simple, just to take top level org and all users, including the users in parent orgs, and again do some provisioning. It can be applied some policies, whatever is needed. But then we are getting into quite complex configuration, but it's not that hard. The only tricky part is to figure out what exactly you need to do and then write a proper conditions. So that was it, what I had prepared for today. So we can start a discussion. So if anybody have any questions, anything that needs to be clarified. Yeah, I would say it's depending on how you want to approach it. One option is to use surveys. Second option is just to use normal user object and maybe use some category or archetype on top of the user object. On a technical level, it's the same. So it's up to you how you feel it, how you want to structure it. For example, so you can have it as a user with archetype name service, or archetype name service account, or administrator account, or whatever you need. Or you can use object service, and again, maybe with archetype, maybe not. And on a technical level, everything will work exactly the same. The only difference is how you feel it, how you can put some structure in it so you and your colleagues understand it. Yeah, there are two different things, because archetype is internal in MidPoint, but type, the intent and kind is something that is on the resource, on some target system. And you can have arbitrary mapping between those two. This is one option. Basically, you have your structure of your faculties and departments, basically duplicated as two trees, one for employees, one for students. Second option, if you have an assignment, you can actually parameterize it. So you can define what type of relation is it. So if I put member into org, I have standard assignment with default relation, which means member. But I can define custom relations, and I actually did it in one of my blogs, so I can point you to it, and I already did last time. You can define the assignment to one organization, but you can define parameter for the assignment. This assignment means employee, or this assignment means students, and you can have both actually. Mm-hmm. And then when you are working with some roles, or Metaroles in this case, you can define this Metarole should, for example, take only students and not employees. I think there's no significant problem except of the sheer volume of the rules that you can define, but there's no way how to overcome that. Only thing that I know what might be problematic if you are using role auto assignment. So they've defined some rules or conditions on which roles should be automatically assigned to other objects. That might cause some problems if you have lots of this type of roles. Otherwise, I'm not aware of any issue.